Have you ever felt small in the face of a gigantic problem, thinking that no one would believe you? David too. No one gave anything for that frail young man, armed only with a sling, in the face of an unbeatable giant. But he shocked everyone with something few knew, a hidden revelation that changed everything. What if I told you that you could beat the giants in your life the same way? Get ready to find out how. Before we start the video, check if you are already subscribed to the channel. Here I will share incredible content like this, which can transform your life and bring valuable lessons. Israel was at war against the Philistines, a warlike and feared people who lived in the coastal region, in cities such as Gaza and Ashkelon. The Philistines were known for their military strength and advanced weapons for the time. They were camped in the valley of Elah, a plain that separated Israel from the Philistines, and the battle had been raging for weeks. The climate in the region was tense, and the Israelites felt pressured, facing a fight not only against a military enemy, but against fear and doubt. During this war, there was a single obstacle that the Israelites could not overcome: a Philistine warrior named Goliath. No one knew where he came from, but his presence was so intimidating that he seemed to be a force of nature. Goliath was no ordinary man. He was a giant, an immense warrior, over 3 meters tall. To give you an idea, he was almost twice the size of an average Israeli soldier. His body was covered in heavy armor made of bronze. His bronze helmet gleamed in the hot sun of the valley of Elah, and he held a spear so large it looked more like a tree trunk than a weapon. Every day, morning and evening, Goliath appeared before the army of Israel, like a gigantic shadow over the field. With an imposing voice, he challenged the Israelite soldiers. "Choose a man to fight with me. If he defeats me, we Philistines will be his servants. But if I win, you will become our servants." He repeated this challenge day after day with frightening confidence, as if nothing could stop him. His mockery was not just an ordinary taunt. He challenged the faith of the people of Israel. Goliath not only considered himself an invincible warrior, but he also mocked the God of Israel, challenging the Lord himself to send a worthy fighter to face him. This challenge generated unparalleled terror among the Israelites. It was not only Goliath's strength that frightened them, but the idea that someone with such physical power could be defeated by a simple Israeli soldier seemed impossible. Goliath's words reached everyone's heart, and no one dared to raise their voice to challenge him. Veteran soldiers, those who had already fought in battles against other enemies, were now frightened in front of a man. They saw themselves as tiny compared to the immensity of that giant. The Israeli army, instead of preparing to fight, became stagnant, paralyzed by fear. Despair took over the camp, and for 40 days there was not a single man willing to face Goliath. Fear spread like a disease, making all soldiers unable to act, and this situation continued. Every day that Goliath appeared to challenge the Israelites, the army's morale dropped further and further. King Saul, who led Israel's army, was also lost in thought. He knew he couldn't force a soldier to fight that giant. He looked at his men, but they all seemed weak in the face of Goliath's threat. Saul was also aware that he himself could not face Goliath, as he knew that his own size and strength were not enough to defeat someone so powerful. He felt that his people's confidence was dissipating, and that the only way to resolve the situation was to find someone capable of standing up to Goliath. But who could this man be? Where was someone brave enough to face the giant? The battle that was being fought in the valley of Elah was not just physical, but psychological and spiritual. Goliath was using his size and strength to frighten, but more than that, he was attacking the faith of the people of Israel. He defied God himself, the God who had freed the Israelites from slavery in Egypt, who had guided them through the promised land, who had defeated armies far greater than Goliath's. However, at that moment, the people of Israel were so absorbed in fear that they had forgotten the power of their God. They only saw the giant in front of them and felt small and powerless. The God of Israel seemed distant and inaccessible before the immensity of Goliath. This was the situation in the Israelite camp. The army was stagnant, not knowing what to do, while Goliath's challenge echoed in the air. Fear had taken over everyone. But in the midst of this chaos, something unexpected was about to happen. Something that no one imagined, something that no one believed was possible. While the Israeli army lived through days of despair and stagnation, something was about to happen that would change the course of history. David, a simple young sheepherder, lived in Bethlehem, a small city in Israel. He was not part of the army, but he was the youngest son of Jesse, a respected man. David was at home taking care of his sheep when his father Jesse asked him to go to the military camp to bring food to his older brothers who were fighting against the Philistines. David had no idea what was happening on the battlefield. He only knew that his brothers were there, and his mission was simple: bring bread and cheese to them and bring news of how they were doing. Without hesitation, David took the supplies, put them in a bag, and headed towards the camp. The path to the battlefield was not long, but each step felt heavier, especially as he approached the valley where the armies were positioned. When David arrived, the scene he found was unlike anything he imagined. Instead of seeing an army fighting courageously, he saw frightened men, silent, staring at the ground. The sound of armor moving was replaced by the stillness of a psychological battle where no one seemed to have the strength to stand up. Every morning and every night, the cry of Goliath echoed, and no one dared to step forward. David, as a curious and energetic young man, approached some soldiers and asked what was happening. They told him about Goliath's challenge, explaining how much the giant was terrorizing Israel's army. For David, the soldiers' words were difficult to believe. What do you mean God's army was afraid of a single man? How could the soldiers of Israel, who served the Almighty Lord, fear someone so small in the face of the greatness of God? With a determined look, David turned and began to question out loud, "Who is this uncircumcised Philistine who defies the armies of the living God?" His eyes shone with the same confidence with which he had faced lions and bears to protect his sheep in the field. David was not just seeing the giant before him, he was seeing the greatness of God and the shame that challenge brought to the people of Israel. David felt uncomfortable seeing Israel's army so shaken. How could there be so much fear among God's chosen people? He knew from his experience as a pastor that God was faithful and powerful to protect his people, as he had done so many times before. In his young, faith-filled mind, there was no doubt that Goliath's strength was nothing compared to God's strength. With this conviction in his heart, David began to offer to face the giant. For him, the battle was already won, not by his own strength, but by the strength of God. When he approached Saul, the king of Israel, David explained his intention. "I will fight Goliath," he said firmly. King Saul, surprised and skeptical, looked at David. How could a simple shepherd, a young man with no combat experience, face a giant like Goliath? Saul, in his limited vision, could not understand David's unshakable confidence. "You are only a boy," said the king, "and Goliath has been a man of war since his youth. How can you defeat him?" But David, without hesitation, replied firmly, "I am a simple shepherd, but when a lion or a bear came to attack my sheep, I pursued them and defeated them with my own hands because the Lord was with me. The Lord delivered me from the paws of the lion and the bear, and he will rescue me from the hands of this Philistine too." David's confidence was evident. He was not counting on his physical strength, but on the power of God. For him, the fight was not between him and Goliath, but between the God of Israel and the false god of Goliath. Impressed by David's faith and courage, Saul finally consented, although still skeptical. He had David dressed in his own combat armor. However, when David dressed with her, he realized that he could not move. The armor was too heavy for him, and he felt like he couldn't fight like this. David then took off his armor, took his sling, and went to the stream where he chose 5 smooth stones. With the sling in one hand and the stones in the other, he headed confidently towards the battlefield. Saul and the army of Israel watched. In disbelief, how could a boy defeat a giant with a sling and stones? It was an unlikely, almost absurd scenario, but David's faith was beyond any human logic. He believed that it was not he who fought, but the Lord of hosts who would fight for him. With every step David took toward Goliath, he showed everyone that the battle was never about physical strength, but about unwavering trust in the power of God. Goliath, in turn, upon seeing that young man approaching, couldn't help but sneer. He looked at David and scorned him, saying, "Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks?" The giant was ridiculing David, but this only made David's faith stronger. David, undeterred by Goliath's words, responded with determination. "You come to me with sword, spear, and shield, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." At that moment, David knew that victory was already assured, and he needed nothing more than his faith in God. With a quick movement, he placed a stone in the sling and threw it with precision. The stone hit Goliath right in the center of the forehead, and the giant impressively fell to the ground, defeated. The army of Israel, which had been paralyzed by fear, now took courage and advanced, defeating the Philistines and spreading fear among their enemies. The sound of the stone hitting Goliath's forehead was like thunder, a moment that would echo throughout the camp. The giant, who everyone believed to be invincible, fell to the ground with a crash. It was hard to believe what had just happened. Across the entire length of the battlefield, the Israelites sat silent for a moment, not knowing what to say or do. But soon disbelief gave way to a cry of victory. The army of Israel, which had been gripped by fear, now felt a surge of courage propelling them forward. Goliath was defeated. But what had really happened that day was not just the fall of a giant. What happened was a clear demonstration that true strength does not come from physical size, nor from the power of a sword or heavy armor. David's victory was proof that true strength comes from faith in God. David did not need a sword, nor armor, nor great physical strength. All he needed was unshakable faith in the Lord, and with that, he defeated the most feared enemy of all. The scene was surprising. David, the young shepherd, now stood before everyone, with the giant Goliath lying at his feet. Without wasting time, David ran to the Philistine's body, took his sword, and cut off Goliath's head. The army of Israel, upon seeing this, burst into a shout of joy and triumph. The defeat of Goliath meant more than just victory over a physical enemy. It represented victory over the fear, doubt, and shame that had dominated the Israelites until that moment. They were now seeing that with faith in God, there was no giant that was too big. The Philistines, in turn, were astonished. How could this have happened? How could a mere young man defeat his strongest warrior? The answer was simple. They had underestimated the power of God. Goliath believed that his size and weapons made him invincible, but he was wrong. David's faith not only physically defeated the giant, but also broke the hold of fear over the people of Israel. When the Philistines saw Goliath's fallen body, their confidence was shattered. They began to flee, and the army of Israel, invigorated by David's courage and divine intervention, pursued and defeated them. The victory was complete. The army of Israel, once paralyzed by fear, now advanced with renewed strength. They had seen in David what was possible when someone put their trust in God. David was not a trained warrior, but a man with enough faith to face what seemed impossible. He did not defeat Goliath because he was bigger or stronger, but because he knew that God was with him, and that was more than enough. As I looked at that battlefield, the lesson was clear. Trust in God can transform any situation, no matter how difficult or impossible it seems. God does not choose the strongest or most skilled for his deeds. He chooses those who have enough faith to believe in his power. The story of David and Goliath is not just about a young man's victory over a giant. It is about the victory of faith over fear, of confidence over doubt, and of courage over weakness. When David defeated Goliath, he not only changed Israel's history at that time, but he also left us with an eternal lesson. He taught us that no matter how immense and threatening life's challenges can be, when we trust in God, we can overcome them. Every giant that appears in our lives, whether physical, emotional, or spiritual, can be defeated with faith and courage. David did nothing in his own strength. He did everything because God was with him, and this truth does not change. Sometimes we feel as if we are facing Goliath with our own giants threatening us. It could be an illness, a financial difficulty, a family problem, or even an internal crisis of faith. But just like David, we can look at these giants with the eyes of faith, knowing that the same God who gave victory to David is the God who is with us today. He hasn't changed. He is the same yesterday, today, and forever. David, by defeating Goliath, not only proved his courage, but also reinforced the idea that with God, nothing is impossible. It is not the size of the problem that matters, but the size of faith in God. If faith in God is great, the problem becomes small, no matter how gigantic it seems. The people of Israel now knew this, and what once seemed like a losing battle turned into an epic victory. Trust in God is capable of transforming defeat into victory, weakness into strength, and fear into courage. Now, looking at our own lives, the question that remains is, what are the Goliaths that we have faced? What are the challenges that seem impossible to overcome? And more importantly, how can we apply David's faith to our own struggles? It's something to reflect on, because like David, we can all find the courage to face our giants. Now tell me, what is the giant you need to overcome in your life? Comment below what you think of this story and share how faith has helped you face your own challenges. David's victory over Goliath had an immediate and profound impact on the entire nation of Israel. The army of Israel, once paralyzed by fear and doubt, was now ecstatic. The soldiers, who were seeing a situation of utter despair, were now shouting and celebrating. The giant had fallen, but the true victory was in seeing what David's faith was able to accomplish. In a single act, David proved that with God, anything is possible. And more than that, he showed that true courage comes from trusting in the Lord, not in human abilities. However, the reaction of Saul, the king of Israel, was more complicated. Although the king had given David permission to fight Goliath, he had not expected such a victory. When he saw young David return from the battlefield with Goliath's head in his hands, Saul felt a mixture of surprise and confusion. After all, who was that boy who, with so little, had defeated the greatest warrior of the Philistines? He looked at David with a bewildered expression. David was not a trained soldier. He didn't wear armor like the others. He was just a young sheep herder with immense faith and a simple slingshot. What else could explain the boy's victory if not the hand of God? Saul then asked David, "Where are you from, young man?" He already knew that he was not a soldier from his personal guard, nor someone who had been trained for combat. David's answer was simple. "I am the son of Jesse from Bethlehem." Saul still seemed perplexed. David's victory was not something he could understand with his logic or his experience. For the king, what he saw there was something beyond any prediction or planning. However, although Saul was surprised by David's courage and skill, it was not long before he began to recognize the young man's worth. David's impact on the battlefield had been so great that it could not be ignored. The army of Israel, which previously lived in the shadow of fear, was now celebrating. Everyone was talking about David, and his name spread like wildfire throughout the camp. What once seemed impossible now seemed to be a reality. David, the shepherd boy, had become Israel's hero, and this victory had an even stronger repercussion when afterwards David was taken to Saul to be formally presented. The king, who already knew him as the young man who played the harp to calm his spirit, now saw David in a completely different way. He was no longer just the musician who eased their sorrows, but the hero who had defeated Israel's greatest enemy. It was something no Israelite could have imagined, the mere appearance of a young man who had become an unusual leader in a time of great need. Over the days following the battle, David's popularity grew rapidly. As the news of David's victory over Goliath spread, people began to sing about him. They composed songs and poems in his honor. One of the most famous songs that began to circulate in Israel said, "Saul killed thousands, but David killed 10,000s." This seemingly innocent song had a powerful effect. Not only did it exalt David, but it also left Saul in an uncomfortable position. Although Saul had been Israel's king and army commander, the people now saw David as a much greater hero, someone who, in a single act, brought freedom and honor to the nation. Saul, who was already insecure in his leadership due to numerous mistakes and failures in his obedience to God, began to feel a growing threat with David's ascension. He saw the young pastor as someone who could challenge him in the future, someone who could take his place. This created a feeling of jealousy and anger in Saul's heart. Instead of recognizing God's hand in everything that had happened, Saul began to look at David with envy. What once seemed to be a relationship of trust and respect was now turning into a bitter rivalry. However, David himself was not interested in taking Saul's place. He had only one thing on his mind: serving the Lord and his people. David's humility was a marked contrast to Saul's growing paranoia. While Saul became increasingly consumed by envy and fear of losing his kingdom, David remained faithful to his mission. He knew that it was not he who had defeated Goliath, but God. And if God had placed him at that moment, he would continue to serve King Saul with loyalty and respect. Despite this, Saul's attitude toward David began to change. Saul began to see David as a real threat to his throne. He was obsessed with the idea that David could take his place and make his reign forgotten. This change in attitude would be the beginning of a long and complicated persecution, a story that would unfold in betrayal, assassination attempts, and much suffering for David. But for now, David had no intention of taking the throne from Saul. He knew that his time would come when it was God's will. Saul's reaction to David's victory reveals something deeply human: fear of loss and wounded pride. Saul, instead of rejoicing in Israel's victory and David's fundamental role, was consumed with feelings of jealousy and insecurity. He did not see David as an ally, but as a rival, and this distorted view of his young warrior would be the seed of hostility that would last for years. On the other hand, David's attitude is an impressive example of humility and trust in God. Even in the face of the people's celebration and Saul's provocations, David continued to focus on his divine mission, keeping his faith intact and his personal integrity. He did not allow himself to be carried away by pride or vanity, but remained faithful to the purpose that God had for his life. He knew that no matter what happened, his mission was to serve God above all else. The relationship between David and King Saul began to deteriorate. While the people of Israel rejoiced in the young shepherd's courage and faith, Saul began to see David no longer as an ally, but as a threat. Saul's resentment was growing, fueled by David's wounded pride and growing popularity. The young man, who had once been welcomed at the royal court, was now the target of suspicion and envy. Soon, Saul's attitude changed. The king, now consumed by insecurity and fear of losing the throne, began to see in David a rivalry that in his mind needed to be eliminated. The same David he had seen defeat Goliath and bring victory to Israel now became the target of relentless persecution. Saul could no longer discern that David's ascension was not a threat to his kingship, but a fulfillment of God's will. Saul did not understand that David had no ambition to usurp the throne, but that he was simply fulfilling the purpose God had given him. Saul's persecution of David began with a series of attempts at manipulation and distancing. Saul tried to bring David closer to him, placing him in prominent positions in his army and even offering him his daughter, Michal, in marriage. Saul believed that by doing this he could control David and perhaps use him for his own purposes. However, David, with his humility and trust in God, was never fooled by these attempts. He remained focused on his mission of serving the people of Israel and God. Saul, in turn, could not understand David's attitude. Saul's paranoia consumed him to the point that he began to plot against David in an increasingly open manner. One of his clearest attempts to destroy David occurred when he, overcome by a fit of rage and despair, decided to personally persecute the young warrior. Saul gathered his army and set out in search of David, determined to eliminate him once and for all. David, in turn, did not react with violence or hostility. Instead, he retreated into the desert, seeking shelter in caves and isolated places. Even though he was constantly on the run, David never lost faith in God. In his mind and heart, he knew that his life was in God's hands and that it would not be Saul's anger or Israel's army that would determine his fate. This trust in God was what sustained David throughout the persecution, as he knew that God would protect him. One of the most significant stories of this persecution occurred when Saul, searching for David, entered a cave to rest. Coincidentally, David and his men were hiding in the same cave. When David's men realized that the king was there in a vulnerable situation, they suggested that he kill Saul, arguing that God had placed the king in David's hands. But David, in an act of great discernment and respect for God, refused to harm the Lord's anointed. He approached Saul, cut off part of his cloak, and when the king walked away from the cave, he showed him proof of his presence. David, with humility and respect, told Saul that he could have killed the king, but he chose not to do so, as he recognized that Saul's life was in God's hands. Saul, upon noticing David's attitude, was touched. He recognized that David was not his enemy, but that he, Saul, had become David's enemy because of his own insecurity. In a moment of repentance, Saul confessed to David that he knew that one day David would assume the throne of Israel and that God was with him. However, even in the face of this momentary reconciliation, Saul's persecution of David did not end. Although the king was remorseful, he was unable to control his feelings of envy and fear, and soon resumed his search for David. Time passed and Saul's persecution intensified. Even with the opportunities he had to destroy his persecutor, David maintained his loyalty to God and his king. He knew it was not his place to take Saul's throne on his own. He would wait for the time when God would put him in power. But in the meantime, he would maintain his loyalty and trust in God. David's story teaches us that we are often challenged to trust God even when we are wronged or persecuted, and that revenge is not ours to take. David's perseverance during persecution was a reflection of his deep faith in God. In moments of great distress and trial, David cried out to the Lord, seeking guidance and strength. He understood that no matter how difficult the persecution was, God was in control of his life. In many of the Psalms written by David during this period of escape, he expresses his unshakable trust in God, even when everything around him seemed to fall apart. He knew that God would not abandon him and that one day divine justice would prevail. Saul's persecution of David is an example of how anger, pride, and fear can consume a person, leading them to commit unjust acts. It also shows us the importance of patience and trust in God. David did not seek revenge, but trusted that God would take care of the situation. This example of faithfulness and trust in God is a profound lesson for all of us, especially when we face difficult times and seemingly insurmountable challenges. Time passed, and eventually God gave David the opportunity to assume the throne of Israel, but he never lost his humility and trust in God. David became a great king, but always remembering that it was God who had put him there. His story is one of the most powerful in the Bible, showing how faith, patience, and trust in God can sustain us through difficulties and, in the end, lead us to victory. Well, we're already reaching the halfway, and I realize that you still have not liked this video. This is very important for YouTube to continue to provide our content to you, so please leave a like on this video, which is free. David's path towards the throne of Israel was not simple. Although he had already been anointed by Samuel as the future king and had demonstrated exceptional courage and faith in defeating Goliath, the path to kingship was marked by many challenges. Saul's relentless persecution was just the beginning of a series of events that tested David's faith and character. He was tested in many areas of his life, and the way he handled these tests prepared him for the role God had in store for him, to be king of Israel. After the death of Saul and his son Jonathan, the transition of power in Israel was not immediate. The kingdom was divided, and David had to deal with resistance from several tribes that still supported the house of Saul. Despite everything, David's name was already recognized as Saul's legitimate successor, especially due to the victories he had achieved throughout his career. However, conquest of the throne was a gradual process and full of challenges. Soon after Saul's death, David withdrew to Hebron, where he was anointed king of the tribe of Judah. But David's reign over Judah was not the end of the struggle, but only the beginning of a period of political complexity. The tribes of Israel were divided, and the house of Saul still had many followers. Ishbosheth, son of Saul, was proclaimed king by those who still resisted David's ascension. This division led to a civil war that lasted several years, with David fighting against Saul's followers and trying to consolidate his power over all of Israel. The battle between the houses of David and Saul culminated in a series of bloody clashes, but God's hand was upon David. Not only did he emerge victorious in several battles, but he also demonstrated impressive wisdom in dealing with internal conflicts. David knew that his mission was not just to seize the throne by force, but to establish a reign of peace and justice for the people of Israel. He always sought to hear God's voice before making important decisions, and this was one of the biggest differences in his rise to power. David also demonstrated great leadership skills by uniting the tribes of Israel under a single kingdom. Although he had a large number of faithful followers, such as his valiant warriors and officers, David did not seek to consolidate his power through brute force or oppression. He knew that to rule wisely and justly, he would need to win the hearts and trust of his people. He showed himself to be a leader who valued loyalty, honor, and justice, and made a point of taking care of all aspects of the kingdom, from political administration to spiritual matters. At a key moment in his rise, David had the opportunity to unite all the tribes of Israel around his leadership. This happened when he was proclaimed king over all Israel, not just over Judah. When the news reached the tribes of Israel, the people recognized in David the leader they had always wanted, someone who would guide them with wisdom and courage, just as he had done in battles against his enemies. His faithfulness to God, his courage, his military skill, and his commitment to the well-being of Israel made him a leader respected by all. including the members of the tribes who had initially resisted his rise. The union of the tribes of Israel was an important milestone in David's reign, but what really sealed his position as Israel's leader was his ability to understand and fulfill God's purpose for his life. He was not just a political and military leader, he was someone chosen by God to guide his people back to worship and fulfilling the divine will. David knew that his reign was not just about human power, but about doing God's will on earth. He was a king who sought to honor God in everything he did, from social justice to temple worship. Soon after becoming king of all Israel, David made a decision that demonstrated his wisdom and his commitment to the worship of God. He brought the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. The Ark was the symbol of God's presence among his people, and David's decision to bring it to the city of David was a way of affirming that the Lord would be the center of his reign. The celebration that accompanied the arrival of the Ark in Jerusalem was a time of great joy and praise, and David danced before the Ark with all his heart, showing his humility and devotion to God. David's decision to center the worship of God in Jerusalem had a profound impact on the kingdom of Israel. This not only strengthened David's position as king, but also revived the faith of the people of Israel, who now viewed Jerusalem as the spiritual and political center of the kingdom. The idea that God was present among his people and that David was his chosen one provided new confidence and stability to the people of Israel. Although David's reign was marked by many victories and achievements, he also faced personal and family challenges. His own life was tested by his choices, including his famous sin with Bathsheba and the tragic consequences that followed. However, David sincerely repented and sought God's forgiveness, and this genuine repentance demonstrated the depth of his faith and humility. He knew that despite his failures, God was willing to forgive and restore him, and this restoration was one of the great lessons of his life. Even in the midst of mistakes and failures, God's grace is capable of transforming and redeeming. David became the king who united Israel and established a strong and respected empire. His ascension to the throne and his wise leadership marked an era of prosperity for the people of Israel, and his name was engraved in history as the model of a king after God's own heart. His reign, although full of challenges, was also a demonstration of God's faithfulness to his promises. He was the king who prepared the way for the future reign of Solomon, his son, and for the fulfillment of the messianic promises that would come through his lineage. David, the great king of Israel, a man after God's own heart, was not immune to human failings. His story of faith and triumph is also marked by moments of deep error and regret. The episode of David and Bathsheba is one of the best known in the Bible, and serves as a powerful reminder of how even the most righteous can fall into temptation, and how God's mercy can bring healing and restoration even in the darkest situations. The story begins at a time of peace and prosperity for the kingdom of Israel. David had already established his authority, conquered Jerusalem, and brought the Ark of the Covenant to the city. He had everything a king could want: power, wealth, wisdom, and God's blessing. However, during the spring, a time when kings usually went to war with their armies, David stayed in Jerusalem. This small, seemingly insignificant detail was the beginning of the tragedy that would unfold. One afternoon, David was in his palace, walking on the terrace, when he saw a woman taking a bath. Her name was Bathsheba, and she was the wife of Uriah, one of the brave soldiers who served under David. Upon seeing her, David was immediately attracted by her beauty, and without thinking of the consequences, he sent messengers to bring her to his palace. When she arrived, David committed a serious sin by sleeping with her, resulting in a pregnancy. David's sin with Bathsheba was not just an act of unfaithfulness, but an act of abuse of power. As king, he had authority over everyone in his kingdom, but he used that authority to satisfy his own desires without caring about the consequences of his actions for Bathsheba or her husband Uriah. When Bathsheba discovered that she was pregnant, the situation became even more complicated, and David, instead of taking responsibility for his actions, looked for a way to cover up his sin. David tried to deceive Uriah by sending him back to his home, expecting him to lie with his wife and think the child was his. However, Uriah, a man of integrity and honor, refused to go home while his fellow soldiers were on the battlefield. He didn't want to enjoy the comforts of his home while the soldiers were in a difficult situation. David then saw that his plan had failed, and in a moment of desperation, ordered Uriah to be placed on the front lines of the battle, where death was almost certain. This dark strategy worked. Uriah was killed in battle, and David thought he could now take Bathsheba as his wife, hiding his sin. When Bathsheba learned of her husband's death, she went into mourning, but after the period of mourning, David took her as his wife. Everything seemed to have been resolved for the king, but he did not know that his actions had generated a serious spiritual consequence. The sin he had committed had not been forgiven, and God was not silent about what David had done. The prophet Nathan was sent by God to confront David about his sin. Nathan used a parable to reveal to David the gravity of his action. He told the story of a rich man who, having many sheep, took a poor man's only sheep to make a feast. When David heard the story, he was indignant and said that the man should be severely punished. Nathan then revealed to him that the story was an allegory about what David had done to Bathsheba and Uriah. Nathan declared, "You are that man." David's sin was exposed, and the king realized the depth of his failure. He had acted selfishly, destructively, and unfairly, and now he must face the consequences of his actions. David, when confronted, did not try to justify his sin or blame others. He acknowledged his guilt before God and deeply repented. In one of David's best-known Psalms, Psalm 51, he expresses his sincere repentance and pleads for God's mercy, saying, "Create in me a pure heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me." David knew that his sin had broken his relationship with God and others, and he wanted to be restored. Although David sincerely repented and asked for forgiveness, the consequences of his actions were inevitable. God forgave David, but the kingdom of Israel would not remain immune to the effects of his sin. The child that Bathsheba was carrying, the result of her relationship with David, died shortly after being born. This was a direct consequence of David's sin, and he grieved deeply over the loss of his son. Furthermore, the consequences of David's sin also affected his family. From that moment on, David's sin triggered a series of tragedies in his home. His sons, including Amnon, Absalom, and Adonijah, began to commit acts of violence and rebellion, which resulted in conflict, death, and division within their own family. What appeared to be an isolated moment of personal sin turned into a series of events that eroded the peace and unity of the kingdom of Israel. Despite this, David maintained his faith in God and continued to seek his guidance throughout his life. God's forgiveness did not erase the consequences of his actions, but restored his relationship with him. David never stopped being a man after God's own heart, and his story serves as a powerful reminder that even when we fail, God's grace can restore us. But true repentance and a change of attitude are essential if we are to live according to God's purpose for our lives. David's story with Bathsheba teaches us many lessons. Firstly, it reminds us that no one is immune to temptation, and that the wrong choices can have devastating consequences. It also teaches us about the power of repentance and God's mercy. Even the greatest leaders and men of faith can fall, but true humility lies in recognizing one's own mistakes and seeking restoration in God. Not only did David receive God's forgiveness, but he also continued to rule wisely, knowing that his relationship with God was the foundation of everything he did. David's reign was not a sequence of isolated victories, but a construction of moments of faith, failures, repentance, and redemption. Throughout his life, he faced many challenges, but he also left a profound legacy of wisdom, leadership, and trust in God. David's legacy was not just about the physical kingdom he built, but also about the spiritual lessons we can apply to our own lives, especially in times of hardship and difficult choices. One of the first lessons we can learn from David's life is the importance of remaining faithful to God, even in times of prosperity. When David was anointed king, he was in a time of great success. He had won victories, brought the ark to Jerusalem, and unified the tribes of Israel. From the moment he became king, he could have become complacent and lost in his own power and riches. However, David always sought God's guidance in everything he did. He was not perfect, but he knew that without divine help, his reign would not be successful. And this loyalty to God was the key to his success, because he recognized that his strength came from the Lord and not from his own abilities. However, as we have seen, David was not immune to mistakes. He made mistakes, some serious, like his sin with Bathsheba. Even with his faith in God, he was human, and like all of us, he made bad choices. This brings us an important lesson about forgiveness and divine grace. David demonstrated that although the consequences of our actions can be serious and lasting, genuine repentance can bring restoration. God's forgiveness is available to everyone, regardless of the magnitude of the error. David's life reminds us that even when we fail, God's mercy is available to us if we seek sincere repentance. However, repentance is not the end of the story. David also teaches us that we need to move on after forgiveness. God forgave David, but he still had to deal with the consequences of his actions. The death of his son with Bathsheba and the family chaos that followed were painful, but he did not let it destroy him. He continued his reign and remained steadfast in his faith, reminding us that true spiritual growth does not only happen in victories, but also in difficulties and moments of pain. David knew that, even in his struggles, God was with him, guiding him in every step. In the context of our lives today, we often face difficult decisions, temptations, and even failures. We live in a world that often tells us to seek immediate pleasure, to follow our desires and interests without thinking about the consequences. However, David's life challenges us to live differently. He teaches us that true happiness and fulfillment do not come from power, fame, or wealth, but from a life aligned with God's principles. Her story reminds us of the importance of recognizing our failures, learning from them, and seeking personal transformation. This doesn't mean we must be perfect, but that we must be honest about our weaknesses and be willing to change. David's leadership is also a lesson for today. In the world where many leaders are more concerned with public image and power, David teaches us that a true leader is one who puts himself at the service of his people and who recognizes their total dependence on God. David did not rule with an iron fist, but sought to be fair, humble, and wise, always seeking the well-being of his people. He teaches us that a good leader is one who has a heart to serve, not to dominate. Finally, David's life is an example of perseverance. David went through many difficulties. He was persecuted by Saul. He had to fight against powerful enemies. He dealt with betrayals and revolts within his own family. However, he never gave up on his mission. Even in the most difficult times, he trusted that God was with him, and that trust kept him steadfast. In these days, when difficulties seem unbearable, it is important to remember David and how he faced his trials with unwavering faith. When we feel like we're at rock bottom, we can look at David's life and see that perseverance combined with faith is the key to overcoming any adversity. David's legacy is not just a story of a past king. He is an example of how we can live with faith, face our failures with repentance, and always seek God's forgiveness and restoration. David teaches us that no matter how big our mistakes are, God's grace can heal us and give us a new opportunity. He shows us that with God by our side, we can persevere, learn from our failures, and leave a legacy of faith and service. So, what can we learn from David's life to apply to our lives today? We can be more faithful to God, recognizing that He is our strength in times of prosperity and difficulties. We can understand that repentance is not the end, but the beginning of a new path. We can seek to live with humility and integrity, just like David. And most importantly, we can learn to trust God, even when circumstances seem impossible. I invite you to reflect on how lessons from David's life can impact your personal life. Maybe you are facing a challenge or have made a mistake. Remember, just like David, you can find forgiveness and restore your walk with God. No matter what happened in the past, the future is still in your hands, and God is ready to guide you through any storm. And if you found this reflection useful, like this video, share it with your friends and leave your comment below. Let's talk about how David's life can help us deal with the challenges we face today. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to continue receiving inspiring content. We are on this journey together. May God bless you, and until the next video.